Have you ever made a decision that felt right in the moment, but later left you thinking, why did I agree to that? No one yelled. No one forced you. And yet, you complied. You smiled. You said yes, even though something deep inside you was saying no. And the strangest part? You couldn't explain what happened. You just knew. It didn't feel like you. Maybe you apologized just to avoid conflict, even when you weren't wrong. Maybe you held back your opinion to keep the peace. Or maybe you felt that quiet pressure to be agreeable, to not make waves, to be the good one. If any of that feels familiar, and for most people it should, then this video is your wake-up call. Because in today's world, manipulation doesn't come with threats or cruelty. It wears a smile. It speaks softly. It feels like kindness. You think you're in control, but you're not. On Psychology Insights, we don't offer comfort for the sake of feeling better. We offer clarity, even when it's uncomfortable. And today, with the ruthless wisdom of Niccolo Machiavelli as our guide, we're going to expose how manipulators really work, not by overpowering you, but by making you think their will is your choice. You'll learn how to spot the guilt traps, the emotional hooks, the subtle scripts written for you without your awareness. And most importantly, you'll learn how to take your power back, not by becoming hard, but by becoming conscious. Because freedom doesn't come from reacting stronger. It comes from seeing sharper. And once you see the game for what it is, you can never unsee it. But before you can protect yourself from manipulation, you need to understand this. It doesn't always begin with lies, conflict, or control. In fact, the most powerful manipulations happen without a single raised voice, in moments that seem completely harmless. That's what makes them so effective. Let's take a closer look at how this actually works. Have you ever noticed how some people always get their way, not by demanding, not by arguing, but by making you feel like their desires are your own idea? They don't push, they don't confront. They simply smile, nod, and let you fill in the blanks. You walk away thinking you made a choice, when really, you were nudged. This isn't charm. It's not charisma. It's calculated awareness. They watch for hesitation in your voice, read the micro-expressions on your face, and listen not to your words, but to what you're avoiding. They don't need to pressure you directly, because they've already mapped out the emotional shortcuts in your personality. They know when you crave approval, when you avoid conflict, when you'd rather sacrifice your boundaries than disappoint someone. And that's where the game begins. You're not being tricked, you're being studied. Not through force, but through quiet observation. This is the kind of influence that rewires your instincts without you realizing it. You begin to doubt your own discomfort. You tell yourself, maybe I'm just overreacting, but you're not. You're being conditioned to silence your intuition and hand over control, one tiny compromise at a time. That's the terrifying beauty of psychological manipulation. It doesn't need to fight you. It only needs you to stop trusting yourself. And the longer you ignore that subtle dissonance within, the more fluent manipulators become in speaking your emotional language, better than you speak it yourself. If you think manipulation starts with other people, think again. It actually begins within, in the parts of yourself that remain unhealed, unexamined, or ignored. No one can truly control you unless they find a way to speak directly to your emotional blind spots. Sometimes, it's a fear you've never named. Sometimes, it's a buried need for love. And sometimes, it's a past experience you thought you forgot, but it still drives your choices from the shadows. Take Anna, for example. She's the kind of person everyone praises for being kind, thoughtful, easygoing. But behind the compliments lies a lifetime of choices she didn't fully make for herself. She agrees to help, even when she's exhausted. She stays in a controlling relationship because she doesn't want to hurt her partner. When he says, "I only act this way because I love you," she smiles, even though something inside her recoils. She isn't being forced. She simply never learned how to put herself first, and he knows that. Anna's story isn't rare. Many of us grow up learning that love is conditional, that we must earn it by being agreeable, selfless, or quiet. We internalize the belief that our worth depends on how useful or compliant we are. Manipulators understand this. They don't need to insult you. They just make you feel selfish for having boundaries. Others are driven by guilt. Guilt for saying no. Guilt for disappointing someone. Guilt for wanting more than survival. That's when the manipulator plays the victim. You're the only one who understands me. Without you, I have no one. These aren't commands, they're emotional contracts. And you become the rescuer, even when you're drowning. The most effective manipulation doesn't rely on force. It relies on subtle exchanges. You give up your truth to avoid conflict. You give up your energy to maintain connection. And over time, you give up your identity, piece by piece, just to avoid the discomfort of saying, enough. But realizing this doesn't make you weak. It makes you aware. And awareness is the foundation of true strength. When you start reviewing your choices honestly, you begin to see that not every demand deserves your attention. Not every cry for help is coming from a place of love. And not every sacrifice is noble, especially if it costs you your peace. It's like opening a door that's been quietly shut inside your mind for years. Suddenly, you see that many of your so-called choices weren't choices at all. They were reactions. Reactions to fear, to insecurity, to a hunger for validation. And unless you confront them, someone else will always be able to pull your strings, simply because you never learned how to hold them yourself. Recognizing manipulation is only the beginning. If you want to truly break free from it, you need something deeper, something that goes beyond awareness. You need emotional immunity, not numbness, not coldness, but the ability to remain internally stable, even when others try to unbalance you. Because the truth is, manipulators don't need power over your life. They only need power over your reactions. Emotional immunity starts with studying your patterns. When do you give in too quickly? When do you stay silent just to avoid tension? When do you overextend yourself to prove your worth? Most people want to stop being manipulated, but few are willing to face the real reason they're vulnerable: predictable emotional responses. If someone can consistently trigger guilt, fear, or the urge to please, they don't have to control you. You'll do it to yourself. Let's bring this into the real world. Jack is a team leader in a competitive office environment. He notices that every time his manager praises him in public, she follows up with an urgent favor afterward, a late-night report, a client call on the weekend. At first, he feels flattered, valued. But then he realizes it's a cycle. Praise becomes a lever. His need for recognition is being used as currency. Once he names this pattern, he starts choosing differently. He still appreciates compliments, but no longer lets them buy his time. This is emotional immunity in action: observing without absorbing, responding without reacting, seeing the strategy and not falling for it. To build this, you need to practice strategic detachment. This means staying engaged without getting entangled. It means you can care without being consumed. You can help without losing yourself. It's not about becoming heartless. It's about becoming clear. Sometimes, silence is more powerful than explanation. Sometimes, stepping back is wiser than pushing forward. You don't owe anyone your energy just because they know how to provoke a response. Another powerful tactic: break your own patterns. If people know you'll always say yes, start saying no. If they expect you to chase, pause. If they rely on your emotional predictability, disrupt it. The more unpredictable you become, not in a chaotic way, but in a conscious, measured way, the harder it is for anyone to manipulate you. And all of this becomes easier when you are anchored in your identity. The more you know who you are, what you value, and what you will no longer tolerate, the less external pressure can bend you. Manipulation thrives in confusion. Clarity is your shield. So here's a question for you. What's one emotional pattern you've noticed in yourself, a reflex that others tend to exploit? Maybe it's apologizing. Maybe it's rushing to fix everything. Or maybe it's staying quiet when you should speak. Share it in the comments. Let's build a space on Channel Psychology Insights where awareness isn't just talked about, it's practiced. Your experience might help someone else wake up on their own. Because once you stop reacting on autopilot, you become the one who sets the tone, not the one being played. Emotional immunity is powerful, but it's not always enough when the manipulation comes from someone you love. It's one thing to spot subtle control in your boss or a distant friend. It's another thing entirely when it comes from your partner, your parents, or someone you've shared years of vulnerability with. Because here, the rules change. Manipulation doesn't sound like pressure. It sounds like affection. It doesn't warn. It whispers. And it doesn't command. It quietly conditions. You don't hear, "You have to do this." You hear, "I thought you cared." You hear, "I'm just disappointed, but it's okay." You hear, "After everything we've been through." And without realizing it, you begin to shrink. Not because you're weak, but because you're afraid to hurt someone who says they need you. You adjust. You anticipate their moods. You censor yourself to avoid setting them off. And eventually, your silence becomes a strategy for survival. Let's talk about Maya. She's in a long-term relationship with someone who rarely yells, never insults, and often says, "I love you." But over time, Maya notices she's walking on eggshells. She second-guesses her opinions, delays her goals, and avoids certain topics. Her partner doesn't forbid her from growing. He just makes her feel guilty when she does. He doesn't say, "Don't change." He says, "You're not the same anymore." So she stops evolving. Not because she wants to, but because love has been fused with guilt. This is how emotional chains are built, not by force, but by implication. You don't see the prison because you're the one who builds the walls. Out of empathy, out of duty, out of fear of abandonment. It happens in families too. You're told, "You can't do this to your mother," or "Don't forget who sacrificed for you." These statements don't need to be shouted. They just need to trigger your emotional loyalty. The same happens at work. "We believed in you when no one else did," which really means, "Don't question us now." All these messages have weight, but weight doesn't equal truth. Love, respect, and gratitude are not weapons. When they're used to keep you in place, they're no longer genuine. They're leverage. So how do you break the cycle? You begin by reclaiming the right to define your boundaries, not explain them. You say no without defensiveness. You express your truth without the need to justify it. And when the emotional backlash comes, the withdrawal, the guilt-tripping, the silent treatment, you hold your ground. Because here's the harsh reality. Not everyone who loves you knows how to love you in a healthy way. And sometimes, the most compassionate act you can do is to walk away. Not with anger, but with self-respect. Not to punish them, but to protect what's left of you. When you finally recognize how manipulation can disguise itself as care, especially in your closest relationships, a deeper question begins to form. How do you reclaim your autonomy in a world built on influence? It's not enough to walk away from toxic dynamics. If you don't change the way you perceive power, you'll keep finding yourself in new versions of the same emotional traps. What's needed now is a shift from emotional instinct to strategic awareness. This is where Machiavelli's brutal honesty becomes useful, not as a tool for domination, but as a blueprint for self-preservation. Machiavelli understood something most people prefer to avoid. Perception often matters more than truth. In a world where emotional control is subtle and manipulation wears a friendly face, those who lack psychological strategy are easily swept into roles they never chose. If you want to stop being a pawn, you must start thinking like the player. That begins with observation, not just of others, but of yourself. What are the patterns people count on you to repeat? Are you always the one who softens tension? Who explains too much? Who fills every silence out of discomfort? Manipulators thrive on predictability. They don't need to overpower you. They just need to anticipate you. Break the script, and you break their advantage. Next comes restraint. Most people overexpose themselves, emotionally, verbally, even digitally. They share too quickly, defend too eagerly, and reveal far more than they realize. But when you learn to withhold, to pause instead of rush, to listen instead of fill, you gain an unsettling kind of power, not through force, but through mystery. Unpredictability isn't chaos. When used wisely, it's clarity with boundaries. Consider someone like Jordan. He's always been open, generous, and eager to be liked. But after being blindsided in several relationships, romantic, professional, even within his family, he decided to rethink how he engaged. He stopped over-explaining himself, stopped rushing to fix what others broke, started observing more than reacting. Within months, people treated him differently. Not because he became colder, but because he became clearer. He no longer made himself emotionally available to everyone. And as a result, manipulators lost interest. There was no leverage left to pull. This is what emotional strategy looks like in action. Not playing games, but refusing to be played. To truly escape manipulation, you must take radical responsibility for your own mind. That means choosing clarity over comfort, intention over impulse, and self-command over social approval. You stop asking, "What do they want from me?" and start asking, "Why am I so ready to give it?" And most importantly, you learn to protect your inner world. You don't let others define your worth with flattery. You don't let guilt distort your values. You don't let fear of abandonment override your boundaries. Because once you know your mind, you stop outsourcing your peace. At this point in the journey, you've peeled back the layers, from hidden emotional triggers to subtle psychological traps. And now, you stand at the edge of something more powerful: mastery. Not over others, but over yourself. So here's the final challenge. What would it look like if you stopped living on emotional autopilot? If your reactions were no longer shaped by past wounds, but guided by conscious choice? Let us know in the comments. Share one shift you're ready to make: a new habit, a different mindset, a boundary you'll now protect. At Channel X, we believe awareness means nothing if it's not turned into action. Your comment might be the spark someone else needs. Because in the end, the goal isn't to control others. It's to ensure no one ever quietly controls you again. Now that we've unraveled the quiet mechanics of manipulation, from external tactics to internal vulnerabilities, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The greatest danger isn't someone else pulling your strings. It's not realizing those strings were there in the first place. In this video, we explored how manipulation operates beneath the surface, player, not through control that feels obvious, but through emotional cues so subtle they often pass as love, concern, or support. We dissected how people use charm, guilt, fear, and even silence to redirect your behavior. But we also looked inward at how unresolved wounds, unexamined habits, and a need for approval make you more susceptible than you realize. The goal was never to make you paranoid. It was to make you perceptive. Because when you stop confusing pressure with care or guilt with responsibility, you begin to think on your own terms. And from that space, from clarity, not fear, you make better decisions, stronger boundaries, smarter moves. Machiavelli never taught cruelty for its own sake. What he offered was a lens, a way to see power as it really works. In a world where influence is currency, your job is not to become ruthless, but to become unshakably self-aware. So, let me ask you, what's one shift you're going to make after this video? Will you say no where you used to fold? Will you pause instead of over-explaining? Will you trust your discomfort rather than override it? Drop your answer in the comments, not just for us, but for yourself. The act of naming it is the first step toward reclaiming it. And if this message spoke to you, don't stop here. Subscribe to Channel Psychology Insights and explore the rest of this series on psychological self-defense, boundaries, and power dynamics. Every video is designed to sharpen your mind and protect your peace. Because the most powerful person in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one who sees the game and chooses not to play by anyone else's rules. See you in the next one.